All right. Hey, everyone. Gonna get started now. I'm kind of gonna be walking around a little bit, but let me know if you have any trouble hearing me. So we're here today to talk about Drupal 8, the new workflow tools that we have available to us, and kind of how you can leverage those in all of your new projects. What I'm going to present today is just a opinionated framework, I guess, of tools that we've put together at Last Call Media. These aren't like internal tools. These are all tools that are available through, open source means. So I'm just going to talk about the pieces that we use in all of our new builds and how we've kind of stitched those together. The sort of like end result of this work is the scaffolding project, which is linked to in that GitHub link right there. If anyone wants to, you can check it out. It's open source, and feel free to sort of check it out and create any issues or whatever you need. Yeah, so problem statement. We had an issue at Last Call where basically we were starting all of these new projects, and the process of getting a new project bootstrapped was getting way too complicated. I think this issue really compounds itself in Drupal 8, where you've got a lot of different pieces that need to get put together in order to do things kind of the right way. So, the issues that we were running into were like how to pull in Drupal core and all of the contrib projects so they're easy to update, and furthermore, patch when we need to. So you can use something like drush make, that's one solution. But then you have things like external libraries. And in Drupal 8, we're already starting to see this shift of modules depending on external pieces. And that's something that drushmake doesn't necessarily do very well. There is a great tool out there, which is Composer, which we wanted to leverage, but which was really hard to kind of bootstrap onto something that already exists. So we were looking at not only how to pull in our Drupal dependencies, but also our external dependencies, whether those be PHP, Sass libraries, whatever you need. Also an asset pipeline. So we wanted to have like first-class asset compilation, meaning we wanted to be able to compile Sass, we wanted to compile JavaScript, we wanted to have it minified, and that stuff doesn't really make sense to do in Drupal. Drupal, using aesthetic, we're now capable of doing some of that pipeline within Drupal, but it's a separation of concerns thing. You don't necessarily want to do all that stuff in PHP. Also, sort of the testing process. So for all of our new sites, we wanted to be able to do things like Bhat tests and unit tests. And that was becoming really cumbersome to set up on every single project. Coding standards. So it's pretty important when you have a lot of developers working on a project that you're following a single sort of style guide, and we wanted a way of enforcing that across the board. And last but not least, environments. So this is a tricky one, right? You have your production environment, you have your development environments, and then every developer may have a totally different stack that they use locally. So we wanted to kind of eliminate all of those issues and make it just turnkey to get started on a Drupal 8 project and really have a lot of these best practice problems solved. So yeah, and then basically where we were coming from is that we had projects that were on Acquia, we had projects that were on Pantheon, we had internally sort of built projects, and everyone was doing everything a little bit different. Sometimes you'd use gulp, sometimes grunt, sometimes compass, and so we just wanted to make it standard across the board. So I talked about the coding standards. These are things that we don't want to change between projects. So in other words, we work on, 50 different projects in a year probably. And so we want to have a consistent set of coding standards. We want to have a consistent set of development tools that we use. So that would be, things like Drush and Gulp, whatever. And we wanted the interface to those tools to remain the same. So when you onboard onto a new project, you're not figuring out, do I need to install Grunt? Do I need to install Gulp? How do I compile things? What are the commands? And the other thing we didn't want it to change was the deployment process. We want that to be nice and standard, whether we're deploying to Acquia, Pantheon, wherever, platform. The things that we wanted to be flexible in between projects were the packages that are actually used. So we didn't want our scaffolding tool to specify the Drupal modules that we're going to use. We wanted that to be completely open-ended. Front-end frameworks, so maybe we're using Foundation, maybe we're using Bootstrap, maybe we're not using either of those. Custom code is obviously going to be different on every project. And the actual content of the pipelines, what happens in there, so like, do we minify JavaScript, do we not? That stuff we wanted to be flexible as well. So we wanted the interface to the asset pipeline to be the same, but we wanted the pipeline itself to be able to be different. And the tests that actually go into it are going to be different as well. So that was our problem. The solution that we came up with was to build a scaffold to use for starting projects. And I want to stress that this is our scaffold, but anyone could build something like this. It's very easy, and it's a very good exercise in terms of figuring out what matters to your organization and kind of capturing all the pieces that are important to you. So our goals are quick to set up, capture those best practices. We want to standardize on tools. We want the standard developer experience across the whole thing. We want the asset pipeline. Yeah, this is all kind of stuff that we covered. The two that we didn't really talk about here are the extensible build process. So we want to be able to execute builds and to kind of have that be flexible. Again, when we're deploying to different environments, it needs to be able to accommodate things like Acquia settings or Pantheon settings or whatever. And then we wanted to exclude dependency code entirely. And this is sort of a radical idea for Drupal sites, that you're going to have a repository that doesn't have any of your Drupal modules, your contrib modules, your core code, anything like that committed to it. But it was kind of important to us that we grab that stuff fresh every single time. So I'm going to talk about the tools that we use. And again, these are just examples of what you could use. You could pretty much swap most of these out for something else and achieve a similar result. So we're using Docker. We've really bought into the Docker idea, and that's not to say that we use it always in deployment, like in our production environments, but when we want to spin up a development stack, the easiest way to do that is using Docker for us. And I'm going to pull up a code sample in a second here. Docker is basically just a way to make these portable environments that are written in code and anyone can onboard onto. So you run Docker compose up and you get a full stack. And in our case, our full stack is a lamp stack plus Varnish, Redis, and Solar. So this is a Docker compose file. And this, again, is on that GitHub repository. You're welcome to peruse this on your own. So we have all these different services. And when we actually want to start our application, we don't need our developers to install anything other than Docker. So we just run docker compose up-d. It starts the application, and then they have that full stack locally. So that's a pretty cool thing.
Is that Mac-based, Ubuntu-based, Windows-based? Anything about Windows?
So the stack that we're using, the actual containers are Debian-based, but you can run it on Mac, Windows, Linux, whatever. Yeah. The other thing, so I mentioned not including the dependencies at all. One important piece of that is using Composer and using it fully. So excluding anything that is vendor code. So we use the Drupal.org packages to specify all our dependencies. And that's really been awesome for us. You just run Composer install when you pull the project down, and it pulls in all the PHP libraries, all the modules, Drupal core, anything else you need. You can also apply patches. This is huge. As Drupal 8 sort of matures, this will become less and less of a thing. But for right now, there are a lot of patches to contrib projects that we need in order to launch a site. And so you can specify those in your composer.json. This is the one for the scaffold. And we just specify here that we're going to use the Drupal.org packages. And then we require a couple of packages. And like I said, the actual application here, the Scaffold project, we don't require anything beyond Drupal core as far as modules. We use Drush and we use console. And then beyond that, it's pretty much all development dependencies. Feel free to stop me if anyone has questions. NPM. So, yeah. One of the big things was we wanted our asset pipeline to be completely detached from PHP. We didn't want interdependencies, and we wanted to be able to essentially not have that asset pipeline be a factor in production deployments. We wanted to build our artifact and then deploy it and not have to worry about Node.js or anything like that. So we use NPM in our build process to kind of get our dependencies, gulp, whatever, and then ship them off. I'm going to skip the package file. It's nothing to really look at. Bower is another package manager. It's more used for like front-end stuff. So in our Scaffold project, we pulled in Foundation, Zerb Foundation, and we do that using Bower. One of the really nice things about doing this is that we can then update Foundation to whatever the newest point release is just by running Bower update. And so we're not actually required to have like a sub-theme for the Zerb Foundation theme and update the Drupal theme in order to update our CSS framework. So it really separates the concerns very nicely. All right, static code checking. So this is something that I said was important to us. We wanted to enforce those standards. Drupal core has really led the way on this. And so we basically just hooked on to what core is doing. ESLint is a JavaScript validator, or linter. So core defines a set of rules that you should follow for Drupal coding, and we literally just include those rules. It's very simple. Our ESLint configuration is just extends the core ESLint. Coder. So PHP-CS is a static code checker for PHP. The Drupal coder module, or library, I'm not really sure which it is these days, is a set of rules for PHP-CS that essentially follow the Drupal coding standards. So it can do things like detect certain security issues if you're using database parameters in an insecure way, but also things like spacing and the little paper cuts that drive us all crazy. So we do this during our CI process, and it makes things standard. Yep, there was a question up front.
Yeah, you answered.
Yeah, we do encourage people to run these checks locally before they push anything up, but in practice a lot of stuff ends up getting pushed up to CI and rejected there. Better there than on production. So Bhat. Bhat is a thing that we use sparingly. It's slow. It is a behavioral driven test tool for Drupal, or for any website, really. You can use Bhat in a ton of different ways. Some people use it as a full test suite for their site. We tend to use it more just to test really complex, like JavaScript functionality. It can actually execute JavaScript using something like Selenium or Phantom.js, and click through your website to see what happens. The other thing we use it for is to test command line functionality. It can go out and execute drush or whatever you need. So in our Scaffold tool, we have 2 tests to find. We just hit the home page using Bhat, and then we execute drush. And if both of those run fine, then we know at least the site loads, both on CLI and in the browser. So we recently had a client that was pretty concerned with their front-end performance, and so we wanted to add a tool that would do some sort of basic sanity checking on front-end performance. So we came across this tool, Phantomos, and Phantomos is a wrapper around Phantom.js, which is a sort of JavaScript headless browser tool, and it lets you specify some metrics that you want to test for. So you can say, assert that there are only, 20 HTTP requests made when you visit the home page. Oh yeah, so this is the tool. And it's a command line tool. We use it, we wrap it in gulp, and then these are all the things that you can monitor. And it's really in depth as far as like what you can monitor. You can monitor how many non-gzipped requests are sent or responses are sent, how many domains you hit, how many different DOM elements you have, all sorts of stuff. So we run that as part of our test process, and it's just about finding those smart metrics to set in there for like the initial settings, and then you can assert that they're kept throughout the life of the project. Yep.
So is this something you could use, like if you wanted to have a performance budget, like
Yes.
type thing?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, it just if you kind of like codify your performance budget and then put it into the Phantomos configuration, you can just check constantly that your performance budget is being met. Okay, onto the asset pipeline. In here, I think most of this stuff is probably stuff you've run into before. Autoprefixer may or may not be. It is a tool to do all of that crazy browser prefixing that we all love to hate. So the WebKit, border radius, whatever, all that stuff, you don't need to worry about that anymore. Autoprefixer pulls from the database of caniuse.com, which if you used that site before is really comprehensive in terms of what browsers support what prefixes and attributes. So it'll prefix your code. If you type in, border radius is probably not a great example because I think most browsers just support that on prefix these days. But if you were to type in border radius into your CSS and set a border radius, Autoprefixer is capable of saying, okay, well, IE, 8 doesn't support that, and you've specified that you want IE 8 support, so we're going to prefix this for you. So it's really dynamic, and it lets you just write your CSS without worrying a ton about the backwards compatibility of the prefixes anyway. So as browsers advance, and let's say over the life of a project you drop IE9 support, you can drop that from your Autoprefixer config, and it'll drop any of the prefixes that have been added for IE9.
Just to add to that, you can also specify that you just want browsers with like greater than 2% market share or whatever, and it'll auto-prefix directly to those browsers.
Yeah.
It's pretty sweet.
That is awesome. And I assume that that 2% market share would update as the Can I Use database updates? Yeah. So that's a really cool feature. And again, it can kind of let your CSS just become leaner over time, so you don't need to maintain it. SAS. Any less people in the audience? Thank God. All right. So yeah, we use SAS.
You should have said extra anything. Less people are afraid to raise their hand.
I imagine there probably are. But yeah, no, we use SAS, and we're pretty opinionated about it. It's just the tool that we chose, and it's very powerful. Not a lot I really want to say about that. We use it with Foundation, which I'll get to in a second. And then as far as other tools that we kind of have wrapped up in our build process, we use minification of both JavaScript and CSS, and auto-generation of source maps. So your .scss files or your .js files, when they get minified and you're debugging them in the browser, you can actually trace it back to the line of SCSS or JavaScript that it came from. To wrap all this stuff up, the tool that we chose to run all this is Gulp. You could do the same thing with Grunt. You could probably do the same thing with a lot of tools, but Gulp is a really nice streaming build system. It's a JavaScript task runner. You can customize all of your tasks, and there are just thousands and thousands of different plugins for it. So we use this to tie it all together, and this is the common interface that we have for our developers. This is our Gulp file in the Scaffold. You can see we're including a whole bunch of plugins. And then we have our tasks. The steps that we chose here are install, build, test, and no, that's it. Install, there's a top level task here called install that has 2 subtasks, and when you run the install task, it goes through and runs the subtasks. So in this case, our subtasks of install are install the composer dependencies and install the Bower dependencies. Down here, I forgot check, yeah. So check is static code analysis, and again, we have a couple of sub-steps. We have PHP lint, which is just bare bones, does this PHP code execute? Then we have PHP CS using the Drupal coder module. And then we have our ESLint check. So this task actually doesn't need the site installed at all to run. And so this is the first thing we run on CI. Just check, make sure the code looks good. If it is, we can proceed to whatever testing steps we have. Down here under tests, we have just the top level test command, and that runs those sub-steps, which are Bhat and performance. And so we've talked about Bhat. Performance is Phantomos. There's a little bit more code here than I'd like for the Phantomos stuff, but essentially it just runs a command. Down here, we have a build task. Our build task is where we run the asset pipeline. So the sub-steps are build SCSS, build JavaScript, build copy. And then we have a build watch to sort of just sit there and watch for changes. I'm not going to dive too deep on these steps unless anyone has specific questions. But that's about it for our Gulp file. And then what we do is we include a configuration for it. So that stays more or less the same between our projects. We could edit it, there's no reason not to, but we just prefer to edit this config file. and this specifies all the different packages of SCSS that we're going to compile. Gives them, you know, a source, the maps directory relative to the place it gets output, the Autoprefixer prefix we use, and so we just chose last two versions here, and the destination. So this compiled CSS gets output into the theme directory, the theme directory's dist subdirectory. And we include our Bower components in there as well, so that we're able to reference those from our SAS files. JavaScript, pretty similar. Copy is, let's say you had font files or images that were included from a Bower package. You could copy those into your theme's dist directory. Specify the patterns you want to check for the PHP analysis. JavaScript patterns, and this is where the performance testing goes. And so you were asking about the performance budget before, and so like this would be assert that there are only 5 requests on the home page. If there are more, this test will fail. So when we run gulp test and it goes through, runs Bhat and Phantomas, it'll check against those metrics that are set there. So the theme, base themes are dead. I think that in Drupal 8, with all of this package manager magic available to us, there's very little call for using a base theme if you're going to be essentially implementing the whole thing anyway. If you are going to go with a package theme, obviously that's not the case. But what we prefer to do is just create a bare theme. It does have a base theme of the stable core theme by default. So it gets all the templates and stuff from there, but we just pull in the foundation library on top of that, and then we have a very minimal implementation where we just sort of like wrap the messages, tabs, breadcrumbs, and the pager in foundation's markup. So it doesn't look great out of the box, but it's all you need to get started on a project. And so, let me see, yeah. I'm going to dive into that. And so this is the theme directory. Very minimal, and we just have our scaffold.scss where we pull in foundation, and again that would be included from Bower, so that would be the latest version. We run foundation everything, which essentially outputs all of the foundation classes, and then we can import anything we need on top of that in here. Another important thing is that Foundation allows you to recompile with your own variables. So we set things like link color and padding for the header and that kind of stuff in this global.scss file. And Foundation gets compiled after that, and so Foundation is every time our own custom build. So it keeps things nice and lean. And we don't have a base theme to really worry about. Inside our templates, obviously we're using Twig here, this being Drupal 8, and we just have a couple, status messages, that kind of stuff. Pattern libraries. So I know Chaz is here, and he loves the pattern labs. We stole that idea and kind of gave it a Drupal flavor. This is a really...
Borrow it. You take it and put it back on the web, it's borrowing.
Okay, all right, borrowing. It is out there. And so, yeah, the idea is that you have this living style guide, and it's very minimal. Our implementation here is passing through the Drupal theme system, for better or worse. We specify different patterns that we want, and those can be atoms, molecules, or atoms, elements, or molecules, I think, is what we support. Your theme can implement style, patterns.php. So your theme can actually have classes, which is kind of cool. And in here you specify your patterns. So we have a status message pattern, we have a typography pattern, we have a list pattern. And then in some of these, let's take a look at like status messages. So the difference here between something like patternlabs is this is passing through the Drupal theme system. So we're calling theme status messages on this theme. We give it the message list, and what we get out is the exact markup that you would get from running when you see a status message on the site. So here is what that looks like right there. And so we've used this as kind of our way of separating the markup out a little bit, but we also sort of acknowledge that Drupal has a lot of weird quirks, and we don't want to be writing twig templates that won't work with Drupal. So at least for the time being, this is the direction we're headed in. All right, so last but not least, all of this stuff kind of depends. This whole idea of not committing things to the repository is great, except that then you need to put it on Pantheon or Acquia or Platform or wherever, and you're going to need those dependencies. And so this depends on having a CI service in the mix to kind of pull all this stuff together. And the CI implementation is actually really, really simple. We have those kind of common interface tasks that we run, and those correspond with how we build this site. So if we look at the travis.yaml for this thing, you can see that we've got a nvm install to set the node version correctly. We've got an npm install, and then we run gulp install, which, if you remember, installs both composer and packages. Here we have a composer validate command, but really it's just gulp check. If check passes, we go on to the build step, and then we would go on to the test step. Assuming all that passes, we could then release this thing, which means pushing this to an upstream repository. So in this kind of setup, you're going to end up with an Scaffold repository, and you're going to end up with an artifact repository. And your artifact repository does contain all your dependencies. We've built a script for this, which, let's see, is really just a shell script, and this, you could replace this with your own implementation very easily. So it's just push to downstream, and so we specify where it needs to go. We specify the branch and the commit message, and it clones the downstream repository, builds the site, and pushes it up. Pretty easy. Yep.
So, have you guys deployed anything like on Platform SH using this? Because I know with Platform SH, they kind of have their own build system in place, so you don't even have to worry about like Jenkins or Travis. We haven't deployed the platform yet. But yeah, I mean, if there is a build system on the platform, I know like Platform has something. I know Acquia is building pipelines. You could totally use those. Yep. Historically, Drupal hosting has not done any sort of CI, and so you've needed something like that. Yeah. As far as where this thing is going in the future for us, we're thinking about separating out the web accessible files. So we don't want to have people be able to hit vendor libraries in the browser. We want a lean kind of production mode. Right now, you're getting all of the composer like dev dependencies and everything shipped up to your artifact. So we're thinking about how to set up a build process that doesn't have all of those extra dependencies. We want to get PHP unit in there and running and set up so that that's easy on each new project. Keep going with the pattern library. I think that's a valid idea. Sort of this hybrid of like a pattern labs approach mixed with the Drupal theme system. And then asset pipeline. So the tools just keep developing for this. There's stuff like Browserify now where you can include different stuff from SCSS and JavaScript and have that get pulled in automatically. And then things like sprite generation and stuff like that. And then finally, I think there's just a lot of work to be done in the community around figuring out what to do with these artifact builds, whether they're a good idea at all, whether they're going to be replaced on each hosting platform by a CI service or what. And that's about it. We have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any.
Can you bring back the slide with the names of the slides?
Yep, so the slides are actually linked to from the repository. Yep, they're right here.
Okay.